People have always tried to explain behavior, human and otherwise, but some behaviors are more difficult to explain than others.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
We know why most school children can cite the Pledge of Allegiance. They've been taught to do so. We call this rote learning.
With liberty and justice for all.
But how do we explain a child's first words?
Alpha.
Why is it that only humans can communicate using symbols? We know how a child learns to avoid being burned with hot food. It usually only takes one burn and the child won't touch it again. We call this simple conditioning. Some behaviors are far more mysterious. A 1-year-old child will react to its mirror image as if it's seeing another child, but a 2-year-old will react to its image as a reflection of itself. How do we explain this phenomenon? It's easy to explain why a child will reach into a cookie jar. The child has gotten cookies by doing so. But what about those exciting instances that every parent has proudly observed? When a child is confronted with a difficult situation and a creative problem-solving kind of behavior seems to emerge mysteriously. In casual conversation, we often attempt to explain these interesting behaviors by saying the child is intelligent, thinks creatively, or uses reason. Psychologists have borrowed many of these terms from laymen and have added many similar ones of their own, such as mental image, self, and ego. Behavioral psychologists argue that such terms don't really explain anything. Many are only inferences from behavior and cannot therefore be used to explain it. Behaviorists assert that all our behavior, no matter how complex, is the result of our genes and our environmental history. Until recently, behaviorists have studied only relatively simple behaviors in the laboratory and have only speculated about how simple processes might account for more complex behaviors. But in 1979 at Harvard University, Robert Epstein and B.F. Skinner began a unique series of experiments which brought complex behavior into the laboratory. Prompted by increasing reports from primate laboratories in which behavior was attributed to mental processes, they began confronting head-on some of the thorniest issues in the analysis of complex behavior.
One very good example was a paper which claimed to show that chimpanzees could communicate with each other, expressing ideas and so on.
They did tell you about the extensive training that their animals had, and they then turned around and attributed the behavior they were observing not to the training, but to the information and knowledge that the chimps possessed, to a message that was being transmitted from one to the other, to the intentions of the chimps and that kind of thing. In other words, they turned around and interpreted this behavior in everyday human cognitive terms.
And so we arranged a situation in which pigeons would do even more complicated communication, if that's what you're going to call it, and did indeed succeed in getting what certainly looks like the behavior of a speaker and the behavior of a listener.
Epstein and Skinner, with colleague Robert Lanza, trained two pigeons whom they named Jack and Jill over a 5-week period, using standard laboratory techniques called shaping, fading, chaining, and discrimination training. Jack and Jill could observe each other through a clear plastic partition and could each peck plastic keys on the panel in front of them. Jack's task was to peck one of 3 colors, red, green, or yellow, which matched a color only Jill could see. When conditioning was complete, Jack, the bird on the left, initiated each exchange by pecking and thus illuminating a sign on his side of the partition labeled, "What color?" Jill, the bird on the right, then thrust her head through a curtain on her side of the chamber where a color was illuminated. She then pecked the corresponding letter on her panel, R for red, G for green, and Y for yellow. Having seen this, Jack pecked a sign labeled "Thank you," operating Jill's feeder for a few seconds. Finally, Jack pecked the color key corresponding to the letter Jill had illuminated, and this response operated Jack's feeder for a few seconds. After feeding, Jack then initiated a new exchange. Watch the exchange in slow motion. Jack pecks "What color?" Jill thrusts her head behind the curtain and then pecks the letter corresponding to the color she has seen as Jack watches her closely. Jack pecks the "Thank you" key as Jill looks on intently. Finally, Jack pecks the color key which operates his feeder. The birds engaged in this exchange with greater than 90% accuracy for extended periods of time. A new color appeared at random behind the curtain after each trial. Incorrect pecks turned the chamber lights off for a few seconds.
That as scientists, I don't think we can claim that we learned much new from this exchange. It was really more a demonstration than anything else. What we had done was show that some environmental history, a certain set of experiences, if you will, can produce very complicated language-like behavior in simple organisms.
We had an apparatus in which we had one pigeon talking to another, and we exchanged the roles. They could go either way. Either pigeon could be a speaker and either one could be a listener. So it was a natural thing to do, to take out the partition and put just one pigeon in and see whether it would, in a sense, talk to itself. And that's what actually happened.
After a few minutes in this situation, a smooth sequence of behaviors emerged. Jack thrust his head behind the curtain where the color was illuminated and then, although not required to do so, pecked the corresponding letter key. He then moved to the left side of the chamber and pecked the appropriate color key, often looking back at the illuminated letter key. It seemed the pigeon was using the letter keys as humans use a memorandum. In casual terms, the pigeon pecked the letter key to help it remember the hidden color. Both birds repeated the sequence thousands of times.
We did a series of tests over a period of about 5 months that convinced us anyway that our guess, our original guess was right, that these pigeons were indeed using the symbol keys as we use memoranda. For example, we found that if we would remove the curtain from in front of the hidden color, thus making the task much easier, Jack or Jill, after a period of weeks, would stop using the symbol keys. That is, it would simply go color to color, color yellow, and then walk across the chamber and peck yellow. If we then made the task harder by reintroducing the curtain, at least one of the pigeons went back to using the symbol keys and virtually without error. With Jill, we made the task even harder still by introducing a delay between her peck at the hidden color and the availability of the color keys on the left-hand side of the chamber. And when we made that delay long enough, she made more and more errors until finally she began pecking at those letter keys to bridge the delay.
Well, we feel that under these circumstances, two repertoires which we had set up separately, speaker and listener, actually came together quite spontaneously. We did not train the bird to use a memorandum. We trained it to be a speaker and a listener, and quite without exception, it began to talk to itself.
I think we had seen in the memorandum experiment the emergence of genuinely new behavior. We had seen the emergence of behavior that could be interpreted in human terms, that was meaningful in human terms, and that it was functionally distinct. I mean, it did something new. We became increasingly interested simply in sources of new behavior, sources of novelty that are not particularly mysterious, but where the controlling stimuli are readily apparent. One such source, for example, that's very important for children is imitation.
Apple. Say apple. Apple.
We had planned simply to teach one pigeon to imitate another and then to see whether this tendency to imitate would generalize to new responses. We had taken it for granted when we began this work that there wouldn't be much in the way of spontaneous imitation, that we would have to teach the imitation to begin with. And then, to our surprise, one day, one of our undergraduate research assistants literally ran into the office and said that one of the pigeons she was working with was spontaneously imitating another bird that was getting reinforcement for, I believe it was pecking a ping pong ball.
I had actually made a mistake many years ago. I tried to show imitation in a pigeon and hadn't got it. And in the textbook, which I'm now sorry about, I said that animals at that level imitate only when the behavior is instinctive behavior. But what we did was to set up a situation in which one pigeon seeing another behaving in a particular way would have an opportunity to imitate, and to our surprise, that happened.
In one experiment, they taught a bird on the left side of a double chamber to peck at a ping pong ball by reinforcing the behavior with food. A pigeon in the right side of the chamber had never been involved in laboratory experiments and had never eaten from an automatic food dispenser. When placed in the chamber alone, it did not peck the ball. When it could observe a bird in the left-hand side of the chamber pecking the ball, however, it began spontaneously pecking the ball and continued to do so during several daily sessions. Furthermore, it continued to peck at a low rate even after the conditioned bird was removed and looked repeatedly in the direction of the absent bird as it did so. After getting the same result with other birds and other behaviors, Epstein and Skinner began again to look at some of the more mysterious sources of novel behavior. Social scientists have been interested in something called the self-concept for decades. Since the late 1950s, psychologists have used a child's behavior towards its own reflection as an index of the self-concept. It was said to appear in stages. In the late 1960s, an objective test was devised that was said to indicate when a child had crossed the threshold and was now aware of its own body. Some rouge was smeared on a young child's forehead, and the child was encouraged by its mother to look at its reflection. If the child touched the rouge spot, it was said to have an awareness of itself. This behavior was also said to indicate that the child had a self-concept.
The word is used as if it referred to a thing, which it does not. Some psychologists go so far as to say that it is a thing inside of you which grows. Second, this kind of concept, as far as I'm concerned, just obscures the search for the controlling variables of the behavior it is said to produce. That is, it doesn't tell you what the real causes are, and it keeps you from looking at them. And third, self-concept is really very little more than a description of what people do, and what children do, and what some chimps do. And it is then mistakenly used to explain the behavior that you see. The critical question is, how do you explain the behavior of a child when it is in front of a mirror and it uses the mirror to find something on its body, a spot, that it cannot see directly? And what we did was try to guess what kind of experiences had allowed the child to achieve that. And it turned out to be quite difficult to come up with those. And finally, over a period of about a year, I think, we stumbled onto two repertoires that did seem to be the correct ones.
Epstein and Skinner, with colleague Robert Lanza, spent 10 days establishing those two repertoires in a pigeon. First, without a mirror present, they taught a bird to scan its body for blue stick-on dots and to peck them. Dots were placed one at a time on virtually every part of the bird's body that it could see. They thus provided a repertoire of pecking itself, something the bird doesn't ordinarily do. Second, they trained it to make use of a mirrored space. It received food for facing a mirror and then turning to peck the place on the wall behind it where a blue dot had been briefly flashed. Dots were never placed on its body with the mirror present. Finally, they conducted the following test. A blue dot was placed on the pigeon's breast under a white bib. When the bird stood fully upright, the dot was visible to others, but the bib made it invisible to the pigeon, because when it bowed its head even slightly, the bib covered the dot. In a control condition, the pigeon was placed in its chamber with the mirror covered. If it could see the dot or locate it using tactile cues, it could peck it, but none of the three birds tested did so. When the mirror in the right side of the chamber was uncovered, however, the pigeon standing fully erect could see the blue dot in the reflection. At this point, each pigeon began bobbing and pecking repeatedly at the place on the bib which corresponded to the position of the blue dot. No food was presented during this test, and the bird had never before been exposed to a mirror when a dot was on its body.
As I see it, there are three possible conclusions. The first is our pigeons have a self-concept. And I don't think very many people are going to go for that one. I hope not. And the second is that the mirror test is simply a bad test of self-awareness. And many psychologists who have a vested interest in this test will object to that. But many psychologists are going to be in favor of that conclusion. And a third conclusion, which is, I think, clearly where we stand, is that the concept is simply not a useful scientific category.
Well, what we did was to take what was said to be an example of the behavior which showed a self-concept. We were able to set it up in a pigeon by quite explicit analysis of the contingencies, and that is all. I think we attribute the behavior to what we know to have caused it rather than to a self-concept. Now, if someone wants to say, but that's not a good measure of a self-concept, we can simply say, give us another one, and we'll do that.
How far can this type of analysis go in explaining complex behavior? Could it deal with behaviors for which we reserve such terms as inspiration, creativity, logic, or genius? In 1917, a German psychologist named Wolfgang Köhler, isolated on the island of Tenerife by the war, observed some extraordinary problem-solving behavior by a number of chimpanzees, and his observations have been the subject of debate among psychologists for over 60 years. He arranged problems for them to solve and found that very often they came up with solutions very much as humans do. In one situation, he placed bananas out of reach in a cage in which there were several chimpanzees. At first, the chimps tried to get at the bananas by jumping. In another part of the cage, Köhler placed a small wooden box. After about 5 minutes, one of the chimps, named Sultan, clumsily moved the box over toward the bananas, climbed on the box, and, jumping with all his might, managed to pull down the bananas. How did Köhler explain this behavior?
Well, I don't think he explained it at all. He attributed it to something he called insight, which he insisted was beyond any ordinary explanation of behavior. And of course, in his day, there was not very much available by way of a science, and he couldn't possibly be right at the time. There was no way of explaining the behavior with the science available. But today is quite a different story, and simply to say the chimp showed insight is to tell us nothing.
In the 1940s, there was a psychologist named Birch who took some of the Köhler kinds of observations and showed that chimps who did not have certain experiences could not solve these problems. So he was showing how important these experiences were. Now, if we were going to try to test an environmental account of the solution to the box and banana problem, what we would do is we would make some guesses about what kinds of experiences were relevant to the solution of the problem, just like we did in the self-concept, the so-called self-concept experiment. It seems pretty clear that a chimp, or a child for that matter, who solves this problem has had a long history of reinforcement for pushing things around. It seems clear that a chimp or child has had a long history of climbing on things, and particularly climbing on things to get other things. A pigeon would be a good candidate to test this kind of account because, first of all, pigeons do not normally push things around because they don't have the limbs. And second, they don't normally climb on things because they can fly. So what you would want to do here is provide a pigeon with each of those repertoires. That is, through techniques of conditioning, get it to push things around, get it to climb on a box, say, and peck a little toy banana that's out of reach. Then finally, you would place it in a test situation in which there's this little toy banana, and there's a history of reinforcement for pecking this banana, and somewhere else in the chamber, there's a little box. The result you would want is the following. You would want it to look pensive somehow or other. You'd want it to walk around in apparent confusion. You'd want it to look up at the banana, look over at the box, stretch up toward the banana, look back and forth between the two, and so on. And then at some point, rather suddenly, move the box toward the banana, and as it's doing so, look up at the banana. Sight the banana. Finally get it in about the right place, climb, and peck the banana. If we could get that kind of result, we could offer a fairly convincing account of how some history of conditioning contributes to success in this problem.
What we've done in the whole Columban simulation project is to show that by exploiting what we know about contingencies of reinforcement, we have produced extremely complex behavior which would ordinarily be attributed to higher mental processes of one sort or another. That, I think, is it. And I believe that we should then stop talking about the higher mental processes and look instead at the contingencies of reinforcement which are responsible for the behavior as we have demonstrated.
The accounts we're giving are not the whole story, and that's perfectly clear to us. For one thing, genes obviously play an important role in what we're observing here, and it's critical that one learn more and more about the role that genes play in the acquisition of complex behavior. For example, language, if genes are important there. Also, we don't really know what's going on inside the organism when these very interesting things are happening. When repertoires are coming together or whatever, there's obviously some very important behavior going on inside. And it's going to take a very sophisticated neurophysiology to tell us what is going on inside, and that's got to be done. Also, there are possible dangers in extrapolating from animal data to humans. And you always have to keep that in mind when you're drawing conclusions from this work. What I'd like to see someday is a kind of interdisciplinary approach to the study of complex behavior. You're only going to be able to give complete accounts of the kinds of behaviors we've looked at by knowing something about genes, about the nervous system, and obviously about environmental histories. But you've really got to know everything someday. There's got to be a synthesis, a grand synthesis of information, as there was, for example, in evolutionary theory in the 1930s. A synthesis of this sort is obviously a long way off, but I think work in this direction is worth pursuing, and it's certainly preferable to the highly speculative, mentalistic accounts that are currently what many psychologists offer.